There is an empire that ruled for over 1,000 years. It conquered Egypt. It built more pyramids than Egypt ever did. It controlled trade routes stretching thousands of miles across the ancient world. And most people have never heard its name. The kingdom of Kush once stood along the banks of the Nile, south of Egypt, in a region that today falls within modern Sudan. At its height, Kushite kings wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. They commanded armies that marched through the sands of the Sahara and into the fertile crescent of the ancient Near East. Their cities were filled with temples, palaces, and monuments carved from sandstone and granite. Their priests read the stars. Their metalworkers forged iron in quantities that astonished the ancient world. Their queens, known as Candaces, wielded a kind of political and military authority that few women in the ancient Mediterranean could have imagined. And yet, when we speak of the great civilizations of antiquity, Kush is almost never mentioned. Greece is remembered, Rome is remembered, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, all of them live in our textbooks, our museums, our popular imagination. But the kingdom that existed alongside them, that traded with them, that fought against them, that in some cases defeated them, that kingdom has been pushed to the margins of history. Not because it was small, not because it was insignificant, but because the story of who gets remembered and who gets forgotten is never a neutral story. It is shaped by conquest, by prejudice, by the slow erosion of records, and by the quiet assumptions of scholars who for centuries simply did not look south. Consider this. According to current archaeological surveys, the region around the ancient Kushite city of Meroe contains more than 200 pyramids. That is more than all the pyramids found in Egypt. These are not crude imitations. They are steep, elegant structures built with precision and care, many of them containing burial chambers adorned with painted scenes of the afterlife, golden jewelry, and inscribed pottery. Some of them date back more than 2,700 years, according to scientific estimates. And for centuries, the Western world either ignored them or attributed them to Egyptian influence, as though the people of Kush could not have built something magnificent on their own. That assumption, that Africa south of Egypt was a cultural blank space, a wilderness without cities or writing or statecraft, has done more damage to our understanding of ancient history than almost any other scholarly error. It has erased one of the longest-lasting kingdoms the world has ever known. It has hidden an entire chapter of human achievement beneath layers of colonial bias and academic neglect. And only now, in recent decades, are archaeologists beginning to uncover what was lost. But here is what makes the story of Kush more than just a historical footnote. It is a warning about what happens when we allow the memory of an entire civilization to fade, because the knowledge that disappeared with Kush, the language, the religious practices, the political systems, the technologies, did not vanish in a single catastrophic event. It vanished slowly, piece by piece, over centuries, until the people who once lived in those cities no longer remembered what their ancestors had built, and the rest of the world simply stopped asking. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what the kingdom of Kush really was. Not the simplified version, not the footnote, the full scope of a civilization that lasted longer than Rome, that challenged the greatest empires of its age, and that was deliberately forgotten by the very historians who should have preserved its memory. You are going to understand why Kush matters, not just as a chapter in African history, but as a mirror held up to our own assumptions about what civilization means, who gets to define it, and how easily the achievements of millions can be buried beneath the sand. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. To understand Kush, we must first understand the landscape that gave birth to it. The Nile River, the longest river in Africa, and one of the longest in the world, stretches roughly 6,650 kilometers from its sources deep in the heart of the continent to the Mediterranean Sea. For most of recorded history, the civilizations that flourished along its banks depended on its annual floods, which deposited rich, dark silt across the floodplain and turned the desert into farmland. Egypt, The most famous of these Nile civilizations occupied the northern stretch. But south of the First Cataract, a series of rocky rapids near the modern Egyptian city of Aswan lay a different world. This was Nubia, a corridor of fertile land squeezed between the eastern desert and the western Sahara, carved by the Nile as it twisted southward through what is now northern Sudan. The land was harsh in many places, baked by relentless sun, but it was also rich in gold, in iron ore, in ebony, in ivory, in cattle. And it was along this stretch of the Nile, in the region between the First and Sixth Cataracts, that the kingdom of Kush emerged and endured for more than a millennium. The earliest roots of Kushite culture reach back into deep antiquity. Archaeological evidence from the site of Kerma, located near the Third Cataract of the Nile, suggests that a complex, organized society existed in this region as early as roughly 2,500 years before the Common Era, according to current scientific estimates. That places the beginnings of Kushite civilization in the same broad era as the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the time of the Great Pyramids at Giza. This is not a late arrival. This is not a secondary culture borrowing from a more advanced neighbor. This is a civilization that developed alongside Egypt, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in conflict, for thousands of years. The Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet spent decades excavating the site of Kerma, beginning in the 1970s. What he found stunned the academic world. Kerma was not a village, it was a city, a sprawling urban centre with massive mud brick structures, including a monumental religious building known as the Western Defufa, which still stands today at a height of roughly 19 meters. The Defufa is one of the oldest and largest mud brick structures in all of Africa. Inside and around it, Bonnet's team uncovered evidence of a sophisticated society, specialized workshops, extensive cemeteries with elaborate burial goods, and signs of long-distance trade networks reaching into Egypt, the Levant, and possibly beyond. The Kingdom of Kerma, as this early phase is sometimes called, flourished for roughly 1,000 years before it was conquered by the Egyptian New Kingdom around 1,500 years before the Common Era. The Egyptian pharaohs, eager to control the gold mines and trade routes of Nubia, pushed their armies south and imposed direct colonial rule over the region. For several centuries, Nubia was administered as a province of Egypt, governed by a viceroy known as the King's Son of Kush. Temples were built in the Egyptian style. Egyptian gods were worshipped alongside local deities. The Nubian elite adopted Egyptian customs, language, and writing. But here is the critical point. Colonial rule did not erase Kushite identity, it transformed it. The people of Nubia absorbed Egyptian culture, but they did not become Egyptian. They maintained their own traditions, their own artistic styles, their own sense of who they were. And when the Egyptian New Kingdom collapsed around 1070 before the Common Era, weakened by internal divisions and foreign invasions, the people of Kush seized their opportunity. What followed was one of the most extraordinary political reversals in the ancient world. Over the next several centuries, a new Kushite kingdom consolidated power in the region around Napata, a city located near the Fourth Cataract of the Nile, close to a sacred, flat-topped mountain called Jebel Barkal. The rulers of Napata built temples, trained armies, and developed a centralized state that grew steadily stronger as Egypt grew steadily weaker. By the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, the Kushite king Pa, sometimes spelled Pianki in older sources, launched an invasion of Egypt itself. Pa's campaign is recorded on a monumental stele, a large inscribed stone slab, discovered at the Temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal. The text, written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, describes how Pia marched his army northward through Egypt, city by city, defeating local rulers and rival dynasties who had fragmented the once great kingdom. The stele portrays Pa not as a foreign conqueror, but as a restorer of order, a pious servant of the god Amun, who wept at the neglect he found in Egyptian temples. By the end of his campaign, around 728 before the Common Era, Pa controlled virtually all of Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast to deep into Nubia. This was the beginning of the 25th dynasty of Egypt, also known as the Nubian dynasty, or the Kushite dynasty. For roughly 70 to 80 years, Kushite kings sat on the throne of the pharaohs. They wore the double crown. They built monuments at Karnak, Luxor, and Memphis. They restored temples that had fallen into disrepair. They reunified a country that had been torn apart by civil war. And they did it all while maintaining their Kushite identity, their devotion to the god Amun in his Nubian form, and their connection to the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, far to the south. To put this in perspective, consider what it means for a kingdom from the south to conquer Egypt. In the popular imagination, ancient Egypt is often treated as the pinnacle of African civilization, a singular achievement unmatched by its neighbors. But the reality is more complex. Egypt was conquered multiple times throughout its long history, by the Hyksos, by the Persians, by the Greeks, by the Romans. The Kushite conquest was one of these moments, but it carries a particular weight because it came from within the African continent, from a people who had been colonized by Egypt and who then turned the tables on their former rulers. It is a story of resilience, of cultural survival, and of political ambition on a scale that deserves to be far better known than it is. Now let us consider the question of scale in another way. When we think about the great empires of the ancient world, we tend to measure them in terms of territorial extent, military power, or architectural achievement. By all of these measures, Kush deserves a place in the first rank. At its greatest extent, the Kushite sphere of influence stretched from the Mediterranean in the north to somewhere near the modern border of Sudan and South Sudan in the south, a distance of roughly 2,000 kilometers along the Nile. Its armies fought against the Assyrians, the most powerful military force in the Near East at the time. Its trade networks connected it to the Red Sea coast, the Horn of Africa, and the Indian Ocean world. But perhaps the most striking measure of Kushite achievement is simply time. The kingdom of Kush, in its various phases, Kerma, Napata, Meroe, lasted for well over 2,000 years if we count from the earliest evidence at Kerma to the final collapse of Meroe around 350 of the Common Era. Even if we use a more conservative dating and begin with the rise of Napata around 800 before the Common Era, we are still looking at a kingdom that endured for more than 1,000 years. Compare this to Rome. The Roman Republican Empire, from the traditional founding date of 753 before the Common Era to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 of the Common Era, lasted roughly 1,200 years. The Kingdom of Kush, by the most conservative estimates, lasted nearly as long. By the broader estimates, it lasted considerably longer. Yet Rome fills entire libraries. Kush fills a few shelves. Consider another comparison. The average human lifetime today is roughly 70 to 80 years. 1,000 years of Kushite history represents approximately 13 to 14 human lifetimes placed end to end. Imagine standing at the beginning of that chain. The person at the start would have no conception of the world that the person at the end would inhabit. The languages would have shifted. The technologies would have changed. The gods might carry different names. And yet, throughout all of that time, something persisted, a cultural thread, a sense of identity, a connection to the land and the river that bound these people together across the centuries. That thread has been almost completely severed. We cannot fully read the Meroitic script, the writing system developed by the later Kushite kingdom. We do not fully understand their religious practices, their legal systems, their oral traditions. We have fragments, inscriptions on temple walls, scenes painted in tombs, objects recovered from graves, but the full picture is lost. And the reason it is lost is not simply the passage of time. It is the passage of time combined with a systematic failure to look. The great European expeditions of the 19th century, which catalogued and carried away so many treasures from Egypt, largely bypassed Nubia. When they did notice the ruins there, they tended to dismiss them as derivative of Egyptian culture, unworthy of serious study on their own terms. The Italian explorer Giuseppe Fellini, who visited Meroe in 1834, did not come to study the pyramids, he came to loot them. He systematically demolished the tops of several pyramids in search of gold and treasure, causing irreparable damage to structures that had stood for more than 2,000 years. The gold he found, exquisite jewelry from the tomb of Akandake, eventually ended up in museums in Munich and Berlin. The pyramids themselves were left as broken stumps in the desert. This is the paradox of Kush. It was not hidden, it was not inaccessible, it was simply deemed unimportant by the people who held the power to decide what counted as history, and by the time scholars began to take Nubian civilization seriously. Beginning in the early 20th century with the work of George Andrew Reisner at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and continuing with the UNESCO campaign to save Nubian monuments, threatened by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, much had already been lost. The dam itself, completed in 1970, flooded vast stretches of Lower Nubia, submerging ancient sites beneath the waters of Lake Nasser. Some monuments were relocated, many were not. The Aswan High Dam displaced roughly 50,000 Nubian people from their ancestral lands. It drowned villages, cemeteries, and archaeological sites that had not yet been fully excavated. The UNESCO campaign, while heroic in many respects, it successfully relocated the temples of Abu Simbel and Philae, among others, could not save everything, and what was lost beneath the water included not just physical structures, but living cultural landscapes, places where the descendants of the Kushite people still lived and maintained traditions stretching back centuries. So when we ask the question, what was Kush, we are also asking a harder question. What does it mean when an entire civilization is allowed to disappear from human memory? This is not a question about the ancient past alone. It is a question about the choices we make in the present, about which stories we tell, which ruins we preserve, which languages we study, and which peoples we consider worthy of remembrance. The answers to that question are more troubling than most people expect. And this is where the real mystery of Kush begins, not with its rise, but with its fall, and with the silence that followed. The core problem of Kush is not that it disappeared. All civilizations eventually decline. The core problem is that we do not fully understand why it disappeared. We cannot fully read what its people wrote, and we have allowed the memory of one of the longest-lasting kingdoms in human history to be reduced to a footnote in the story of its more famous neighbour. Let us start with the language. The Kushite kingdom developed its own writing system sometime around the 2nd century before the Common Era, possibly earlier. This script, known as Meroitic, was used to write the Meroitic language, which was spoken in the heartland of the kingdom around the city of Meroe. There are actually two forms of the script, a hieroglyphic form based on Egyptian hieroglyphs and a cursive form used for everyday writing. Scholars can read the individual characters. The alphabet was deciphered in 1911 by the British Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who worked out the sound values of the letters by comparing Meroitic inscriptions with known Egyptian texts. But here is the problem. Knowing the sounds of the letters does not mean you can understand the language. Imagine being handed a text written in an alphabet you can read aloud, but in a language you have never heard. You can pronounce the words, but you have no idea what they mean. That is the situation with Meroitic. Despite more than a century of effort by linguists and epigraphers, the Meroitic language remains largely undeciphered. We can read personal names, some titles, and a handful of formulaic phrases, offering formulas from funerary texts, for example. But the vast majority of Meroitic inscriptions are still opaque. The grammar is poorly understood. The vocabulary is mostly unknown. The language does not appear to be closely related to any well-known language family, though some scholars have proposed distant connections to the Nilo-Saharan language group. This means that the voices of the Kushite people are, for all practical purposes, silent. We have their words carved in stone. We have their documents written on papyrus and potsherds, but we cannot read them. The thoughts, the laws, the stories, the prayers of one of Africa's greatest civilizations are locked behind a barrier that modern scholarship has not yet been able to break. Every year, new inscriptions are discovered. Every year, scholars publish new analyses. But the breakthrough, the Rosetta Stone moment that would unlock Meroitic, has not come. And it may never come, because unlike Egyptian, there is no bilingual text of sufficient length and complexity to serve as a key. And it gets worse. The inability to read Meroitic means that our understanding of Kushite history depends almost entirely on external sources. Egyptian texts, Greek and Roman accounts, and the physical evidence recovered by archaeologists. Each of these sources has its own biases and limitations. Egyptian texts portray the people of Kush through the lens of imperial propaganda. When the pharaoh Thutmose III campaigned in Nubia around 1450 before the Common Era, the inscriptions he left behind describe the Kushites as defeated enemies, rebels subdued by divine pharaonic power. These are not neutral records. They are political statements designed to glorify the Egyptian state. Greek and Roman sources are similarly distorted. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, devoted some attention to the people he called Ethiopians, a term that, in ancient Greek usage, referred broadly to dark-skinned peoples living south of Egypt, including the Kushites. Herodotus describes the Ethiopians as the tallest and most beautiful of all people, and he recounts a famous story about the Table of the Sun, a meadow outside the Ethiopian capital, where the rulers supposedly laid out cooked meat each night for the common people to eat. How much of this is fact and how much is legend is impossible to say. Herodotus never visited Kush himself. He was reporting second-hand accounts filtered through Egyptian and Libyan intermediaries. The Roman historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, provides somewhat more detailed geographic information about the Kushite kingdom, which he calls Meroe after its capital city. He describes the island of Meroe, the fertile land between the Nile, the Atbara River, and the Blue Nile, and mentions its iron smelting, its temples, and its powerful queens. But Strabo's account is also shaped by Roman perspectives and prejudices. He describes the Kushites as living in a harsh, remote land, and his tone carries the condescension of a writer from a self-declared center of civilization, looking outward at what he considers the periphery. The physical evidence, the ruins, the artifacts, the graves, is our most reliable source of information about Kush, but it too is incomplete. Decades of archaeological work at sites like Meroe, Naga, Musawarat es-Sufra, and Jebel Barkal have revealed a civilization of considerable sophistication. At Meroe, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a royal city with palaces, temples to Egyptian and local gods, elaborate baths, and an extensive industrial quarter devoted to iron smelting. The slag heaps at Meroe, great mounds of waste material from the smelting process, are among the largest in the ancient world. They testify to an iron industry of remarkable scale, one that may have made Meroe a major center of metal production in ancient Africa. At Naga, roughly 30 kilometers east of the Nile, a temple complex features some of the most striking examples of Kushite art. The Lion Temple, dedicated to the local war god Apedemak, is decorated with carved reliefs showing the Apedemak as a lion-headed man flanked by royalty. The style of these carvings blends Egyptian, Hellenistic, and indigenous African artistic traditions into something unique, something that belongs to Kush alone. There is nothing quite like it anywhere else in the ancient world. At Musawarat es-Sufra, a site in the semi-desert east of the Nile, archaeologists found a vast complex of buildings known as the Great Enclosure. Its purpose remains debated. Some scholars believe it was a pilgrimage center, a place where people gathered for religious festivals. Others suggest it served as an elephant training facility, pointing to the many depictions of elephants in the site's carved decorations. The Kushites, like the Ptolemaic Egyptians after them, are known to have used war elephants, and the African elephant, larger and less easily tamed than its Indian counterpart, may have been captured and trained in the savannas south of Meroe. But without written records we can read, the true function of Musawarat remains uncertain. This uncertainty extends to the most basic questions about Kushite society. How was the kingdom governed? We know it had kings and queens. The Kandakes, or queen mothers, appear to have held genuine political authority, not merely ceremonial roles. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder recorded that a queen named Candace, a Romanized version of the Meroitic title Candake, ruled over the Kushites during the time of the Roman Emperor Augustus. The geographer Strabo describes a military confrontation around 24 before the Common Era between Roman forces under the prefect Gaius Petronius and a Kushite army, led by a one-eyed Candake, often identified as a Manirenas. According to Strabo, the Kushites initially attacked the Roman garrison at Syene, near modern Aswan, and carried off a bronze head of the Emperor Augustus as a trophy. The Romans retaliated by marching south and sacking the city of Napata. A peace treaty was eventually negotiated, and the terms were apparently favorable enough to the Kushites that the Roman emperor himself ratified them. This is a civilization that fought Rome to a standstill and negotiated a treaty on roughly equal terms. The bronze head of Augustus, buried beneath the steps of a temple at Meroe, possibly so that every worshipper entering the temple would symbolically trample the Roman emperor underfoot, was rediscovered by the British archaeologist John Garstang in 1910. It is now in the British Museum in London. A small bronze head, green with age, staring out from behind glass, thousands of miles from the temple where it was buried as an act of political defiance. It is one of the most extraordinary objects in the collection, and most visitors walk past it without a second glance. But here is the problem. For every answer archaeology provides, it raises 10 new questions. We know Kush had a complex economy based on agriculture, herding, trade, and industry, but we do not know how that economy was organized. We know it had a powerful religious establishment centered on the worship of a moon, adapted from Egyptian religion, but with distinctly Kushite characteristics. But we do not know the full range of their religious beliefs. We know they built pyramids, smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, with distinctive attached mortuary chapels. But we do not know the full significance of the rituals performed within them. We know from the evidence of the pyramids themselves that Kushite kings and queens were buried with elaborate grave goods, gold and silver jewelry, glass vessels, bronze mirrors, pottery, furniture, and sometimes weapons. We know that some tombs show evidence of human sacrifice, servants or retainers buried alongside their rulers. Though this practice appears to have been more common in the earlier Khmer period and may have declined over time, we know that the Kushite elite maintained diplomatic and commercial contacts with the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, with the Aksumite kingdom in what is now Ethiopia, with the Roman Empire, and possibly with South Arabian kingdoms across the Red Sea. But the inner life of this civilization, the poetry, the philosophy, the debates, the jokes, the lullabies, is gone. It is locked behind a script we cannot read, buried in tombs we have not found, or simply lost to the slow decay of organic materials in the African sun. And this is what makes the disappearance of Kush so haunting. It is not a sudden catastrophe. It is a gradual fading, like a voice growing quieter and quieter, until it falls below the threshold of hearing. The decline of Meroe, the last great capital of Kush, is itself a mystery wrapped in uncertainty. At some point during the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, the power of the Meroitic state weakened. The reasons are debated. Some scholars point to environmental degradation, overgrazing by cattle, deforestation caused by the voracious appetite of the iron smelting industry, a possible shift in rainfall patterns that reduced agricultural productivity. Others point to the disruption of trade routes, as the rise of the Aksumite kingdom in the Ethiopian highlands diverted commerce away from the Middle Nile. Still others suggest internal political fragmentation, with provincial rulers asserting independence from the central authority at Meroe. What is clear is that sometime around 330 to 350 of the Common Era, the Aksumite king Ezana launched a military campaign against a people he called the Noba, who appear to have been either the remnants of the Meroitic state or its successors. Ezana's victory inscription, written in Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaean, describes a devastating campaign in which he burned their towns, seized their cattle, and carried off prisoners. Whether this represents the final blow to the Meroitic kingdom or merely the conquest of its already diminished successor is a matter of scholarly debate. But by the mid-4th century of the Common Era, the kingdom of Kush as a political entity was finished. The pyramids of Meroe fell silent, the temples were abandoned, the cities slowly filled with sand, and the world forgot. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The forgetting was not passive. It was not simply the natural result of time passing and memories fading. It was actively constructed. When European scholars began to study the ancient world in earnest during the 18th and 19th centuries, they brought with them a set of assumptions about race and civilization that made it almost impossible for them to acknowledge the achievements of a black African kingdom. The great German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, lecturing in the 1820s, declared that Africa south of the Sahara had no history, that it was a land of barbarism and savagery, cut off from the development of the human spirit. This was not a fringe opinion. It was the mainstream view of the European intellectual establishment, and it shaped the way scholars approached the archaeological evidence for decades to come. When ruins were found in Nubia, they were attributed to Egyptian colonists. When sophisticated artifacts were discovered, they were explained away as imports or imitations. When the pyramids of Meroe were identified, they were treated as pale copies of Egyptian originals, unworthy of serious study. The possibility that a civilization south of Egypt could have developed independently, could have achieved greatness on its own terms, was simply not considered, and so the kingdom of Kush was written out of the story, not by an act of destruction, but by an act of erasure, carried out by the very people who claimed to be writing the definitive history of the human past. The story of Kush does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a much larger pattern, a pattern of civilizations that rose to extraordinary heights, flourished for centuries, and then vanished so completely that their very existence was doubted until archaeologists pulled them from the earth. To understand what happened to Kush and what it means, we need to see it in the context of these other lost worlds. Each one offers a different piece of the puzzle. Each one challenges a different assumption about what makes civilizations endure or collapse, and each one carries its own particular heartbreak. Let us begin with the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India from roughly 2600 to 1900 before the Common Era, according to current archaeological estimates. At its peak, the Indus Valley civilization covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rahigahi, were marvels of urban planning. They had standardized brick sizes, elaborate drainage systems, public baths, and grid-patterned streets. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a large waterproof pool surrounded by colonnaded walkways, suggests a society that valued ritual purification or communal hygiene on a scale unmatched in the ancient world. And yet, like Kush, the Indus Valley civilization left behind a writing system that we cannot read. The Indus script, found on thousands of small seal stones and other objects, consists of short sequences of symbols that have resisted all attempts at decipherment. Without the ability to read their writing, we cannot know what the people of the Indus Valley called themselves, how their government was organized, what gods they worshipped, or why their cities were eventually abandoned. We know they traded with Mesopotamia. Indus Valley seal stones have been found at Ur and other Sumerian sites. We know they had a sophisticated system of weights and measures. We know they cultivated wheat, barley, cotton, and possibly rice. But the human voices behind all of this, the laws, the songs, the arguments, are silent. The parallel with Kush is striking. Two vast civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, both reduced to mute ruins because we cannot read what they wrote. The numbers are striking when you consider it. The Indus Valley civilization may have encompassed 5 million people at its peak, making it one of the largest societies in the ancient world, and we cannot read a single sentence they produced. The decline of the Indus Valley civilization is typically attributed to a combination of environmental and social factors: shifts in river courses, reduced monsoon rainfall, possible floods or earthquakes. But the truth is that we do not know for certain what happened. The cities were not burned. There are no signs of a massive invasion. People simply seem to have moved away gradually over the course of several centuries, dispersing into smaller communities that eventually lost the urban character of their predecessors. It was not an apocalypse, it was a quiet dissolution. Now consider the Ancestral Puebloans, sometimes referred to in older literature by the Navajo term Anasazi, though many modern scholars and indigenous communities prefer the more respectful designation. These were the people who built the extraordinary cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde in modern Colorado, the Great House at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon in modern New Mexico, and hundreds of other structures scattered across the desert southwest of the United States. Their civilization flourished from roughly the 1st century of the Common Era to the late 1300s. a span of over 1,200 years. Chaco Canyon, the spiritual and administrative center of the ancestral Puebloan world, during its peak between roughly 900 and 1150 of the Common Era, is one of the most astonishing archaeological sites in North America. Pueblo Bonito alone contained more than 600 rooms and rose 4 or 5 stories high. The canyon's great houses were connected by an extensive network of roads, some stretching more than 60 kilometers across the desert, built with a precision that suggests sophisticated surveying techniques. The people of Chaco traded turquoise, copper bells, and macaw feathers from as far away as Mesoamerica. They tracked celestial events with careful astronomical observations, and then they left. By the late 1200s, the great houses were empty. The cliff dwellings were abandoned. The people moved south and east, eventually becoming the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, and others. The reasons for this great migration are debated, but the leading explanation points to a severe drought that struck the region in the late 13th century, known as the Great Drought, which lasted from roughly 1276 to 1299. Tree ring data from ancient timbers, a dating technique known as dendrochronology, confirms that this was one of the most prolonged and intense dry periods in the region's history. But drought alone may not tell the whole story. There is evidence of social conflict, of increasing violence, of a breakdown in the cooperative networks that had sustained the Chaco system for centuries. The great houses may have been not just administrative centers but instruments of control, managed by a small elite who extracted tribute from outlying communities. When the environmental stress of the drought hit, those social bonds may have snapped. The system was not resilient enough to withstand the pressure, and so the people moved on, carrying their knowledge and their traditions with them, but leaving the stone cities behind. The lesson here is important. Civilizations do not always fall because of a single dramatic cause, an invasion, a plague, an earthquake. Sometimes they erode. Sometimes the slow accumulation of stress, environmental, social, political, reaches a tipping point, and the system that seemed permanent and immovable simply comes apart. This is what happened to the ancestral Puebloans. This may be part of what happened to Kush. Now, let us turn to the Khmer Empire, one of the most powerful states in the history of Southeast Asia. From its capital at Angkor, in what is now Cambodia, the Khmer Empire dominated a vast territory from roughly the 9th to the 15th centuries of the Common Era. At its height, Angkor may have been the largest pre-industrial city in the world, covering an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers. According to remote sensing studies published in the early 2000s, the population, based on current archaeological estimates, may have reached 700,000 to 1 million people. The Temple of Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman II, is the largest religious monument ever constructed, a sprawling complex of towers, galleries, and bas-relief carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology. The Khmer rulers built an extraordinary water management system, a network of reservoirs, canals, and dikes designed to capture the monsoon rains and distribute water across the agricultural landscape during the dry season. This system, known as the Barai, was the engine of Khmer prosperity. It allowed the empire to produce multiple rice harvests per year, feeding a large and growing population. But the system was also its vulnerability. Research led by the Greater Angkor Project, a collaboration between Australian, Cambodian, and French scholars using LiDAR, a remote sensing technology that can see through dense jungle canopy, revealed that the water management infrastructure eventually became so large and complex that it was almost impossible to maintain. By the 14th and 15th centuries, a combination of factors, prolonged droughts interspersed with unusually intense monsoon flooding, infrastructure failure, social unrest, and military pressure from the neighboring Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya overwhelmed the system. Angkor was sacked by Ayutthaya forces in 1431. The capital was eventually abandoned, and the jungle slowly swallowed the temples. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot visited Angkor in 1860, he described the ruins with awe, writing that they rivaled anything the Greeks or Romans had built. But Huetzi also expressed disbelief. that the local Cambodian people could have been the builders. He assumed that the temples must have been the work of some lost or foreign civilization. This is the same pattern we see with Kush. The assumption that the people living near the ruins could not have created them. That greatness must have come from elsewhere. And it gets stranger. Consider Göbekli Tepe, a site in southeastern Turkey that has fundamentally changed our understanding of ancient human societies. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone circles built with T-shaped pillars carved with reliefs of animals: lions, foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes. The site was excavated beginning in 1995 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who dedicated the rest of his career to understanding what he had found. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest construction at roughly 9,600 before the Common Era, according to scientific estimates. That makes Göbekli Tepe approximately 7,000 years older than Stonehenge and roughly 6,000 years older than the earliest known cities in Mesopotamia. The site was not built by farmers living in settled communities. It appears to have been constructed by hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet domesticated plants or animals. This upends the conventional assumption that monumental architecture requires agriculture, surplus food production, and complex social hierarchies. At Göbekli Tepe, the sequence seems reversed. The impulse to build a sacred place may have preceded, and perhaps even motivated, the transition to farming. People may have settled down, not to grow food, but to maintain a temple. Göbekli Tepe is relevant to the story of Kush because it illustrates how much of the human past remains unknown, how many of our assumptions about the development of civilization may be wrong, and how recently we have begun to discover what we do not know. Something is wrong with our assumptions when the oldest known monumental site in the world was built by people we assumed were incapable of building anything at all. Now consider Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, located near modern-day St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak around 1050 to 1200 of the Common Era, Cahokia may have had a population of 10,000 to 20,000 people, with perhaps another 20 to 30,000 living in the surrounding suburbs and satellite communities. Its central feature is Monk's Mound, a massive earth platform roughly 30 meters high and 300 meters long, the largest earthen structure in the Americas. Cahokia had a central plaza, a wooden palisade wall, a series of smaller mounds used for temples and elite residences, and a woodhenge, a circle of wooden posts used for astronomical observations. Cahokia was the heart of the Mississippian culture, a network of chiefdoms and communities that extended across the eastern half of North America. The people of Cahokia traded copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and flint from the Ozarks. They played a ritual ball game called Chunky that had deep spiritual significance. They practiced elaborate mortuary rituals, including mass burials that suggest human sacrifice on a significant scale. And then, by the mid-1300s, Cahokia was abandoned, the population dispersed. The mounds were left to the elements. When European explorers arrived in the region centuries later, there was no living memory of the city or the people who built it. The mounds were attributed to a mythical race of mound builders, distinct from the indigenous peoples of the region. Another instance of the refusal to credit local populations with their own achievements. The reasons for Cahokia's decline are debated. Environmental degradation, deforestation, soil erosion, flooding of the American bottom floodplain likely played a role. Social factors, inequality, conflict, political instability may also have contributed. Some scholars point to a climate event known as the medieval climate anomaly, a period of warmer temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere that may have disrupted the agricultural systems on which Cahokia depended. But the point is not the specific cause. The point is the pattern. Civilizations rise. They build great works. They develop complex social systems. They reach a peak, and then they decline, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And the knowledge they accumulated over centuries or millennia begins to dissipate. The buildings crumble. The writing fades. The language is forgotten. And within a few generations, the people who once lived in those cities become strangers to their own ancestors. Let us return now to Kush and examine what we know about its decline more closely. The later centuries of the Meroitic kingdom, from roughly the 1st century of the Common Era onward, show signs of increasing strain. The pyramids built during this period are smaller and less carefully constructed than their predecessors. Some royal tombs appear to have been prepared hastily. The range of imported goods found in graves diminishes, suggesting a contraction in trade. The great iron smelting industry, which had been one of Meroe's economic pillars, may have begun to decline as the forests that provided charcoal for the furnaces were depleted. At the same time, the Aksumite kingdom in the Ethiopian highlands was growing in power and wealth. Aksum controlled the port of Adulis on the Red Sea, which gave it access to the lucrative maritime trade between the Roman world and the Indian Ocean. As Aksumite power grew, the trade routes that had once enriched Meroe may have been redirected southward, cutting off a vital source of revenue. The Aksumite king Ezana's inscription, mentioned earlier, describes a military campaign against peoples in the Nile Valley that may represent the final conquest of the Meroitic state or its remnants. But there is another theory that deserves attention. Some scholars have proposed that the decline of Meroe was related not just to external pressures, but to an internal environmental crisis. The iron smelting industry required enormous quantities of charcoal, which was produced by cutting and burning wood. Over centuries, this demand may have stripped the landscape around Meroe of its tree cover, leading to soil erosion, reduced rainfall, and a decline in agricultural productivity. In essence, Kush may have consumed the very resources that sustained it. This theory is controversial. Not all scholars agree that deforestation was significant enough to cause the collapse of the kingdom. Some point out that the Butana steppe, the grassland region east of the Nile where Meroe was located, may never have been heavily forested. Others argue that the scale of iron production at Meroe has been overstated. The debate continues, and without written records we can read, it may never be fully resolved. What is not debatable is the completeness of the disappearance. Within a few centuries of its collapse, the kingdom of Kush had been so thoroughly forgotten that even the people living in the region had lost knowledge of its existence. When the first modern travellers encountered the pyramids of Meroe in the 18th and 19th centuries, no one could tell them who had built them. The local communities had their own histories and traditions, of course, but the specific continuity between the ancient Kushite state and the modern Sudanese peoples of the region had been broken. Languages had changed, religions had changed. The desert had covered the ruins. The math is striking. Over 1,000 years of continuous political existence, hundreds of pyramids, temples, cities, an army that fought Rome, a script that recorded the thoughts of kings and queens, and all of it reduced to silence, not by a single catastrophe, but by the slow, patient work of time, climate, politics, and neglect. Each of the civilizations we have discussed, the Indus Valley, the Ancestral Puebloans, the Khmer, the builders of Göbekli Tepe, Cahokia, offers a different facet of this same truth. Civilizations are not permanent. The things we build, the words we write, the systems we create, none of them come with a guarantee of survival. And the gap between the peak of a civilization's power and the total loss of its memory can be shockingly short. What makes Kush unique among these cases is the combination of factors that contributed to its erasure. It was not just abandoned, like Cahokia or Angkor. It was not just lost to environmental change, like the cities of the Indus Valley. It was actively excluded from the historical record by scholars who could not or would not see Africa as a place of civilization. That double erasure, by time and by prejudice, makes the story of Kush not just a historical mystery but a moral one. It asks us to consider who has the power to define the past and what happens when that power is wielded carelessly or cruelly. But the story does not end with loss. In the last several decades, a new generation of scholars, many of them Sudanese, many of them trained in African universities, has begun to reclaim the history of Kush. Excavations at sites like Meroe, Naga, and Danjeel have uncovered new inscriptions, new artifacts, and new architectural remains. Satellite imagery and LiDAR surveys have revealed previously unknown sites. The Meroitic script remains undeciphered, But linguists are making slow progress, aided by computational methods and new bilingual texts discovered in the field. In 2003, a joint Sudanese and British team, led by the archaeologist Julie Anderson, uncovered a remarkable temple at Danjeel, north of Mere, dedicated to the god Amun. The temple had been beautifully preserved beneath centuries of sand and contained painted wall reliefs of extraordinary quality, showing the Kushite king and queen making offerings to the gods. The discovery was hailed as one of the most important finds in Nubian archaeology in recent decades. It reminded the world that beneath the sands of Sudan, an entire civilization still lies waiting to be uncovered. The question is whether we will uncover it in time. Climate change, political instability, and illegal mining threaten many Kushite sites in modern Sudan. The country's ongoing conflicts have made fieldwork dangerous or impossible in some regions. Funding for Sudanese archaeology remains limited compared to the resources devoted to Egyptian sites just a few hundred kilometers to the north. The race between discovery and destruction is ongoing, and its outcome is far from certain. The deeper truth about Kush and about all lost civilizations is that collapse is not an aberration. It is the norm. The great civilizations we remember, the ones that fill our textbooks and museums, are the exceptions. They are the survivors. For every Rome that is remembered, there are dozens of kingdoms that have been swallowed by the earth, their names lost, their people scattered, their achievements ground to dust by the relentless machinery of time. Let that sink in. The archaeologist Joseph Tainter, in his influential book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, published in 1988, argued that civilizations collapsed not because of any single factor, war, famine, plague, but because of a systemic process he called diminishing marginal returns on complexity. As societies grow more complex, they invest more and more resources in maintaining their bureaucracies, their armies, their infrastructure, their information systems. At first, these investments yield substantial benefits, but over time, each additional unit of complexity produces less and less return until the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the benefits it provides. At that point, the system becomes vulnerable to any shock, a drought, an invasion, an internal revolt that tips it over the edge. Tainter's framework helps us understand the fall of Kush in a new light. The Meroitic Kingdom was a complex society. It maintained a centralized government, a professional priesthood, a military establishment, a system of trade and taxation, and a major industrial sector based on iron smelting. Each of these systems required resources to maintain: food for the soldiers and priests, wood for the smelters, administrative capacity for the tax collectors. As the centuries passed, the costs of maintaining this complexity may have mounted, while the returns, in the form of agricultural surplus, trade income, and military security, may have diminished. Environmental degradation, trade disruption, and external military pressure may have been the specific triggers, but the underlying vulnerability was structural. The system had become too complex to sustain itself. This is not a theory confined to the ancient world. The same dynamics can be observed in modern societies. We build systems of extraordinary complexity: financial systems, energy systems, information networks, supply chains, and we assume that they will continue to function because they have always functioned. But complexity is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant reinvestment, and constant adaptation. When the maintenance fails, when the reinvestment dries up, when the adaptation comes too slowly, the system breaks. And when a complex system breaks, it does not fail gracefully. It fails catastrophically, often in ways that no one anticipated. This is not science fiction. This is the documented pattern of human history, repeated so many times that it should be impossible to ignore. And yet we ignore it, because we are always convinced that our civilization is different, that our technology is superior, that our knowledge is more secure. The people of Kush surely believed the same thing. The people of Angkor believed it. The people of the Indus Valley believed it. They were all wrong. But the fragility of civilizations is only part of the deeper truth. The other part is about knowledge, about how easily the accumulated wisdom of centuries can be lost, and how difficult it is to get it back once it is gone. Consider what we have lost with Kush. We have lost a language, The Meroitic language, whatever its full richness, is locked away behind a script we cannot read. We have lost a religious tradition, the Kushite form of Amun worship, with its unique rituals, its sacred texts, its priestly hierarchies. We have lost a political tradition, the system of governance that sustained the kingdom for over a millennium, including the remarkable institution of the Kandake, the queen who ruled alongside or in place of the king. We have lost a technological tradition, the iron smelting techniques, the construction methods, the agricultural practices that sustained a large population in a challenging environment. We have lost an artistic tradition, the distinctive Kushite style that blended Egyptian, Hellenistic, and African elements into something new. Each of these losses is irreversible. Even if we eventually decipher Meroitic, we will not recover the oral traditions, the unwritten customs, the embodied knowledge that existed alongside the written word. The spoken language is gone. The music is gone. The dances are gone. The stories told to children at bedtime are gone. What remains are stones, bones, and broken pottery, the skeleton of a civilization without its flesh. Let that sink in. 1,000 years of human experience reduced to what can survive in the ground. And Kush is not unique in this respect. Across Africa, entire civilizations have been lost or marginalized in the historical record. The kingdom of Aksum, which succeeded Kush as the dominant power in northeastern Africa, is better known but still poorly understood in much of the West. The Great Zimbabwe, a massive stone city in southern Africa that flourished between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, was for decades attributed to Phoenicians, Arabs, or other non-African builders by European scholars who refused to accept that it was built by the ancestors of the local Shona people. The Kingdom of Benin, in what is now Nigeria, produced bronze and brass sculptures of such extraordinary quality that when British soldiers looted them during the punitive expedition of 1897, many Europeans assumed they must have been made by Europeans. The pattern is the same in every case. African achievement is discovered, questioned, attributed to outside influence, and only grudgingly acknowledged as indigenous. This pattern is not an accident. It is the direct product of a worldview that placed European civilization at the center of human history and treated everything else as peripheral. That worldview has been challenged and substantially revised in the last half-century, but its effects are still felt. The textbooks have been rewritten, but the damage has been done. Generations of students in Africa and around the world grew up without knowing that Kush existed, that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, that Benin produced art that rivals anything in the European tradition. The philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has written about the concept of cosmopolitanism, the idea that all human cultures have value, that we can learn from each other, and that the loss of any culture diminishes us all. The loss of Kush diminishes us all. It diminishes our understanding of what human beings are capable of. It diminishes our sense of the diversity and richness of the human past. It diminishes our ability to learn from the successes and failures of those who came before us. And the losses are accelerating. In the modern world, languages are disappearing at an alarming rate. According to linguistic surveys, roughly half of the world's approximately 7,000 languages are in danger of extinction within the next century. Each language that dies takes with it a unique way of seeing the world, a set of concepts, a body of knowledge, a tradition of storytelling and song that exists nowhere else. We are witnessing, in real time, the same kind of cultural erasure that befell Kush. The difference is that it is happening faster and on a global scale. The same is true of archaeological heritage. Conflict, development, climate change, and looting are destroying ancient sites at an unprecedented pace. In Sudan, the country that holds the physical remains of the Kushite kingdom, illegal gold mining has damaged or destroyed numerous archaeological sites in recent years. Miners, desperate for income in a struggling economy, have dug through ancient cemeteries and settlement mounds in search of gold, scattering artifacts and obliterating the stratigraphic context that gives them meaning. What took millennia to build is being destroyed in months. This is the deeper truth, then. The loss of Kush is not an event that happened in the distant past. It is an ongoing process. It is happening right now, as sites are destroyed, as funding falls short, as scholars retire without successors, as the political situation in Sudan makes fieldwork impossible. Every year that passes, the window for recovering the history of Kush grows narrower, and every year that passes, we lose a little more of what it means to be human, not in the abstract, but in the very specific, very concrete sense of knowing what our ancestors built, thought, believed, and dreamed. The Kushite people did not know that their kingdom would be forgotten. They built their pyramids, carved their inscriptions, and worshipped their gods with the confidence of people who believed that their works would endure. They were wrong, not because their works were inferior, but because the forces that destroy civilizations, environmental change, political upheaval, cultural prejudice, are stronger and more persistent than any stone or any script. And so we are left with a question that has no comfortable answer. If the people of Kush, with all their power, all their knowledge, all their ambition, could be so completely erased from human memory, what does that say about us? What does it say about the permanence of our own achievements, our own records, our own sense of who we are? The answer, if we are honest with ourselves, is deeply uncomfortable. It says that nothing is permanent. It says that memory is fragile. It says that the line between being remembered and being forgotten is thinner than we like to believe. What does the story of Kush mean for us today? It means, at the most basic level, that our understanding of history is incomplete. Not slightly incomplete, profoundly incomplete. The history we learn in school, the history we see in museums, the history we absorb from films and television, all of it is a partial account, shaped by the biases of those who wrote it and the accidents of what survived. For every civilization we know about, there may be others we have never heard of. For every language we can read, there are others that remain forever silent. The map of the human past is full of blank spaces, and Kush is one of the largest. This incompleteness has consequences. When we build our understanding of human civilization on a foundation that ignores or minimizes the contributions of entire continents, we arrive at a distorted picture. We overestimate the uniqueness of certain traditions and underestimate the universality of certain achievements. We assume that urban planning, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, and centralized governance were invented in a few favored locations and then spread outward to the rest of the world. The evidence from Kush, from the Indus Valley, from Cahokia, from Great Zimbabwe, challenges this assumption. Complex societies arose independently in many different places, under many different conditions, following many different paths. This matters because the stories we tell about the past shape the decisions we make in the present. If we believe that civilization is a rare and fragile flower that blooms only under specific conditions, we will approach the world with a certain kind of caution, a certain kind of conservatism. If we understand that civilization is a recurring phenomenon, that human beings in many different environments have found ways to organize themselves into complex, productive, creative societies, then we will approach the world with a different kind of confidence. A confidence rooted not in the superiority of any single tradition, but in the resilience and ingenuity of the human species as a whole. There is also a moral dimension to the story of Kush. The erasure of Kushite history was not an innocent mistake. It was the product of a specific set of power relations, colonial, racial, and intellectual, that privileged certain voices and silenced others. Acknowledging this is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing that the way we construct the past has real effects on the present. When African students grow up without knowledge of Kush, of Aksum, of Great Zimbabwe, of Benin, they are deprived of a sense of heritage and continuity that students in Europe or East Asia take for granted. When Western students learn about Greece and Rome, but not about Meroe or Napata, they develop a mental map of the ancient world that is missing an entire continent. Both distortions are harmful. Both can be corrected, but only if we make a deliberate effort to do so. The effort is underway. In Sudan, the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums continues to work, despite enormous challenges, to document and preserve the country's archaeological heritage. International collaborations between Sudanese, European, and American institutions have produced important new discoveries in recent years. The Nubia Museum in Aswan, Egypt, opened in 1997, provides a dedicated space for the history of the Nubian peoples, including the Kushite period. In universities around the world, courses on African history increasingly include sustained treatment of Kush and its legacy. But there is so much more to do. The Meroitic script remains undeciphered. Hundreds of sites in Sudan have never been properly surveyed, let alone excavated. The political and economic challenges facing Sudan make sustained archaeological work difficult, and the broader intellectual challenge of integrating the history of Kush into the mainstream narrative of world civilization is still far from complete. Perhaps the most important implication of the Kush story is the simplest one. It is a reminder that the things we value most, knowledge, memory, identity, are not self-sustaining. They require active effort to maintain. Libraries must be funded, languages must be taught, stories must be told, sites must be protected, scholars must be trained. Without that effort, the accumulated achievements of centuries can slip away, silently, irreversibly, until one day we look back and discover that something precious has been lost, and we cannot even name what it was. There is a particular sadness in that kind of loss. It is not the sharp grief of a sudden destruction, a fire, a flood, a war. It is the slow, aching sadness of a forgetting, the kind that happens so gradually that no one notices until it is too late. The people of Kush did not experience their own erasure. They did not wake up one morning and discover that the world had forgotten them. The forgetting happened after they were gone, carried out by people who had never known them, who could not hear their voices, who could not read their words. It was an erasure committed not by enemies but by strangers, by people who simply did not care enough to look. That indifference is the real villain of this story. Not the Assyrians who drove the Kushite dynasty from Egypt, not the Axumites who conquered the remnants of the Meroitic state, not even the colonial scholars who dismissed African civilization as an impossibility. The real villain is the quiet, persistent, deeply human tendency to assume that what we do not know does not matter, that what we cannot see does not exist, that the silence of the past means there is nothing to hear. There is something to hear. The stones of Meroe still stand. The pyramids still rise from the desert. The bronze head of Augustus still stares from its case in the British Museum. And the inscriptions, those maddening, beautiful, unreadable inscriptions, still wait, carved in stone, for someone to finally understand what they say. We began this journey with a question. How does a kingdom that lasted for more than 1,000 years, that built more pyramids than Egypt, that conquered pharaohs and fought Rome, vanish from human memory? Now, at the end, we know the answer. It does not vanish all at once. It vanishes slowly. First the language is forgotten. Then the writing becomes unreadable. Then the temples are buried by sand. Then the scholars who might have studied it look away, convinced that there is nothing worth seeing. And then, one day, the kingdom exists only as a name in a few obscure texts. A cluster of broken pyramids in the desert, and a handful of artifacts scattered across the museums of the world. That is the story of Kush. But it is also, in a deeper sense, the story of all human achievement. Everything we build is temporary. Every word we write is vulnerable. Every memory we hold dear is one generation away from being lost. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for attention. It is a reason to look more carefully at the ruins we pass by, to listen more closely to the voices we cannot quite hear, to ask the questions we have been too indifferent or too afraid to ask. The kingdom of Kush was not destroyed by a natural disaster. It was not wiped out by a plague. It was not conquered in a single decisive battle. It was eroded by climate, by shifting trade routes, by the rise of rival powers, by the slow depletion of its natural resources, and then it was erased by the prejudices of scholars, by the biases of empires, by the simple, devastating human failure to pay attention. The pyramids of Meroe still stand in the Sudanese desert. They are smaller than their Egyptian cousins, but no less beautiful, their steep sides rising against a sky so vast and empty that it feels like the edge of the world. There are no crowds here, no tour buses, no souvenir shops. Just the wind, the sand, and the silent stones. A few visitors come each year, but most of the world remains unaware that these pyramids exist. Most of the world remains unaware that this kingdom existed. There is a word in many languages for the kind of sadness that comes from losing something. you never knew you had. It is the sadness of a missed connection, a letter never opened, a song never heard. That is the sadness of Kush. We did not know what we were losing while we were losing it. And now that we know, we are left with the fragments, beautiful, tantalizing, heartbreaking fragments, of a world that can never be fully recovered. But fragments are not nothing. Every pyramid that still stands is a testament. Every inscription that still waits to be read is a promise. Every artifact that sits in a museum case, however far from home, is a reminder that the people of Kush were here. They lived, they built, they fought, they prayed, they loved. They buried their dead with gold and pottery and painted scenes of an afterlife they believed in with all their hearts. They were not a footnote. They were a civilization, one of the longest lasting and most remarkable the world has ever seen. The restoration of their memory is not a matter of charity. It is a matter of justice. It is a matter of correcting a distortion in our understanding of the human past that has persisted for too long. And it is a matter of self-interest. Because the story of Kush teaches us something essential about ourselves, about the fragility of our achievements, the impermanence of our certainties, and the terrible ease with which the things we value most can be allowed to slip away. 1,000 years, more than 200 pyramids, a language locked in stone, an empire that fought the greatest powers of the ancient world, a people whose names we cannot pronounce, whose prayers we cannot read, whose faces we can only glimpse in the faded paintings of their tombs. They deserve to be remembered, not because remembering them will change what happened, not because it will bring them back, but because the act of remembering is itself an act of defiance, a refusal to accept that the silence of the past is the final word. It is not. The stones speak if we are willing to listen. The inscriptions wait if we are willing to learn. The pyramids stand if we are willing to look. And in looking, in listening, in learning, we do something more than honor the dead. We protect the living. We remind ourselves that memory is not automatic, that knowledge is not permanent, that civilization is not guaranteed. We remind ourselves that the distance between greatness and oblivion is shorter than we think, and that the only thing standing between us and the same silence that swallowed Kush is our willingness to remember, to look south, to look deeper, to look with open eyes at the fullness of the human story. The wind blows across the desert. The pyramids cast long shadows in the afternoon sun. Somewhere beneath the sand, a temple waits. Somewhere in a storeroom, an inscription sits unread. Somewhere in the future, a scholar will pick up the thread, and the kingdom of Kush will begin, at last, to speak again. Until then, the silence holds. And in that silence, there is something that sounds almost like a voice, ancient, patient, unbroken, waiting to be heard.